It's great to be with you today. I'll try to skate through my presentation. Susanna, I believe you've got that, and I can look to you to be the oracle of PowerPoint on Zoom. I'm coming to you from a Treasury facility. They don't like Zoom, so I'm using some personal tech. So if it falls over, I will quickly come back to you as soon as I can and keep the things flowing along. I want a bit of a shout out to SEAANZ. Keep pushing those thought leadership, those insights, the evidence base. I've taken on this role not imagining that, well, having created it when I was the small business minister in cabinet, to find myself now in it. One of the things that I'm focused on is trying to strengthen the evidence base for policy reform and intervention. We all know around this room, amplified and repeating anecdotes is anecdata. It's not quite as persuasive as hard evidence. So the work that you do is so vital in adding to that evidence picture and policy insights. And I might just take a quick opportunity to say a number of us have worked for years to try and get the small business working group at the OECD elevated to committee status. That has been achieved. So that's fantastic, and hopefully there'll be a great opportunity for shared learnings across that platform. As the new Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, I send you my greetings and recognise we're brought together with a shared purpose of trying to make Australia the best place to start, grow and transform an enterprise. We're not there yet, and when we are, I'll know my work is done, and we'll all feel that we've done worthwhile work along the journey. As I try and keep up with those slides, let's go to the next one, the overview. Just a quick snapshot of what I'd hope to touch on, and I'll try and really truncate my observations so there's more time for discussion. There's a lot of territory we could cover today, and so I'll skate through some of those. But that's a sense of where we're coming from. We know how vital enterprising men and women owning and leading small and family and self-employment businesses are to the economy. Let's remember something. 44% of Australia's private sector workforce is employed in a small business. 44%. But post-GFC, 2/3 of all the new jobs growth came from small business. So there's a disproportionate contribution that small business can make to the recovery based on our most recent experience. We also know, though, there's been a disproportionate impact of COVID on small and family businesses, and we can touch on that briefly. A little bit of a look at how we can help and what my role is, what government assistance is around, and maybe some of the key avenues for recovery in this new post-COVID environment, which is actually an enduring COVID environment, but one we're learning to live with rather than repel in policy settings. Next slide, thank you. I've touched on the juicy stuff there. About 1/3 of the economy, 44% of the private sector workforce. Bit of a number count, nudging towards 2.4 million at the moment, with a surge in new business formation. And there you get that picture that 99% have a turnover under 10 million. So that's the community that we get out of bed every day and bring our A game to support. Next slide. Thank you, Susanna. Quick snapshot. This is the role that I'd created when I was the cabinet minister. Why? Well, I found many government agencies and policymakers had a very poor sense and lens and feeling and insight around the plight of small and family businesses. They are not shrink-wrapped versions of big businesses. Proportionality, right-sized regulation, minimum effective intervention, and different obstacles and challenges to address. That's where the advocacy role comes in. The role has an inquiry and advocacy function. Let me be frank, sometimes that upsets the policymakers, but I thought it was crucial to keep having an avenue where someone could say, hey, we're seeing this, we're not hearing a lot about it. Thankfully, I'm not subject to direction from ministers. I have a statutory appointment by the Governor-General, so I'm pretty hard to fire as well. But importantly, no point going around poking policymakers in the eye every day, because they are the same people I need to collaborate with to actually bring about change. So there's a real calibration and nuance piece there. Assistance, one of the things I saw was too often in our area of endeavour, a small enterprise involved in a dispute had their lack of comparative scale, lack of comparative resources, and in some cases, lack of comparative sophistication, not in themselves in running their business, but navigating dispute resolution and legal processes, was putting them at a further disadvantage. Our job is to get in early and try and resolve disputes through, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, sometimes cajoling, sometimes a little bit of an aha about how people can engage and conduct themselves, and at times activating and managing formal mediation and conciliation. And in relation to the franchise code, if the parties agree, we can activate some arbitration as well. That is about getting matters resolved quickly, keeping relationships intact, and getting business back to business. So that's a real key part of our work. The inform bit, yes, we do our own research, we do inquiries. We're currently navigating the insurance crisis in the amusement, leisure and active recreation area and other things. Currently doing some research on women-owned and women-led entrepreneurship experiences. Why is that important? 2/3 of all the new businesses that have been created in the last 12 to 18 months have been led by women. Yet we know that a woman entrepreneur's experience can sometimes be very different. We're trying to peel that back a little bit, understand what those needless obstacles and headwinds are, and even what role government can play. Some of you would know that the Backing Female Founders program was fabulously oversubscribed. That created its own problems, but it also showed there was an appetite for support and assistance, and we're thinking about how we can do that. The communication function, I'm not very good at that, but I have a go at it every day, trying to highlight and elevate the importance of small and family businesses to our economy and our communities. And one thing I'm thankful for out of COVID, I think people realize that codependency between small and family run business being a vital part of the community fabric, and that with that enterprise at a local level, there's upsides and advantages for the vitality of the community itself. So that's broadly the 4 legs of the chair that I camp on when I'm not on webinars like this. Next slide. Thank you, Sujana. I touched on that. That's basically what the advocacy function is. Won't spend too much time on it. The key one is spend a lot of time and a lot of my day engaging with regulators and policymakers and collaborating with the small business commissioners. And I'll call it the ecosystem within which enterprising men and women seek to thrive in our economy. That's interesting. I chair FRAG, the Federal Regulator Agency Group. I often remind them that, a little initiative there, a little one there, a little contest for eyeballs in time poor small business with that agency runs against another one here. I'm the canary in the coal mine that says, hang on a minute, you've got all these moving parts. Let's think about the cumulative impact on small business. The inquiry function takes a couple of dimensions. A referral from government is one avenue. I've noticed my agency hasn't had the confidence of government for a little while. We haven't seen a referral from government for 3.5 years. That tells me something. That's why I'm being very collegiate in my engagement, because I'm wondering what sits behind that. But that's a key tool that hasn't been activated when we think it could have been on challenging policy matters where someone needs to roll their sleeves up and get under the hood. Next slide, please. Touched on the assistance function, won't spend too much time on that unless someone has some questions about it. Couple of key dimensions, the ADR support in the code environment. All of you on the call will know that there's segments of our economy where there seems to be an inherent imbalance in market power, and that can produce ordinary commercial behavior. Let's think of franchising, let's think of the oil industry, food and grocery, dairy. These are some of the areas where trying to encourage adult to adult mutually respectful commercial conduct has been seen to be needed. Guidance has been required, bumper rails in place, and policy responses have been codes, and codes then come out and actually have a dispute mediation function in it. We put some better practice advice out there, how to navigate the plethora of finance options in this disintermediated finance environment, where the Productivity Commission came out in other days saying no problem to be seen here. I called that and they said, would I speak to the report? And I said, perhaps not, because I won't concur with your conclusion. Their argument was there's so many options, surely a small business can find finance. Biggest issue arising out of our women-owned, women-led survey is, guess what? Access to finance. So anyway, there's work still to be done there. And in terms of public policy advice and insights, we do a bit of work in that space as well. Next slide, thank you, Sujana. How are we going, Sujana? We're getting there. We're like sort of powering through these. Quick snapshot of our disputes picture. That's just a sense of what kind of traffic we get. Overwhelmingly, they're contractual based. Someone not fulfilling their obligations, a small business being told if they pay a search engine optimization business $1,500, their world will be transformed. That doesn't happen. Conflict arises. We get a call to sort it out. And in some cases, you'd be aware we've pioneered a lot of the pay on time, spreading out of payment terms and payment delays. We've championed that for years, and it's good to see some policy action in that response. That's the second largest area. And then we get into other, always love other. So we're working hard on better data analysis, and a bit over 1 in 10 of the matters that we engage with are franchising related. You'll see financial services there. You all know about AFCA. David Locke does great work. But if your financier is not has not subscribed to AFCA's model, where do you go? Well, they end up with us. So the untidy ones end up with my office. Next one, thank you, Susanna. Won't spend too much time on that, but we are about knowledge sharing. We are in the influence space. I should talk to my team. I'm not allowed to use the word campaigns because that triggers a whole lot of excitement in amongst the government, but we do try and win hearts and minds to get support, third-party advocates, an alliance of groups behind policy initiatives and change, and we work collegiately with those groups. You would have seen that during least cost routing. And the last one is around recognition. Seat at the table, have influence, and policymakers know of the plight of small and family business, and make sure that the importance of generating and supporting entrepreneurship remains a policy objective when we think about future economic prospects in this economy. Next slide. Thanks, Juliana. This is My Business Health. Won't spend too much time on it. Some useful resources on there. Interestingly, if we shoot all the way off to the right, I Need Support has an emotional well-being lens on it. We know running and owning a small business is a big responsibility, and our community's up for that. But those responsibilities are very much amplified, and 50% spoke of running a business already adding to their stress levels and sense of emotional challenge. Add COVID on top of that, and we saw a big uptick in people just saying, I'm overwhelmed. I'm just not coping, I'm not sleeping. We've put a number of programs in place, new access to small business owners, mental health coaching program delivered by the Richmond Fellowship and jointly conceived by this agency and Beyond Blue, a great policy response, but trying to make sure, like elite athletes, we're in as good a shape as we can be to navigate these challenging times has been a real focus. And we're seeing distressed business owners completely overwhelmed by the challenges they're facing, and I suppose really confronted by the uncertainty of when they can operate, what opening and closing rules look like. And that's been a real eye-opener, and I'm pleased policymakers are addressing their mind to that, as I know SEAANZ has for some time. Next slide, thanks, Joanna. Quick snapshot, what's happened during COVID? Well, for some, they've had a fabulous pandemic. Others, it ain't been great. And I suppose the point here is that, you've got 3 out of 5 saying, well, what happens when the economic support, stimulus, government assistance turns off? Where am I going to be? So there's some anxieties out in the marketplace around that. There's still the greatest renewable energy in the Australian economy is the small business optimism, still playing its role there. About half still thinking revenue will grow in the coming months. That's encouraging. But look at the numbers that are there. You've got 40% have had to pivot. There's a word everyone hates, but they've had to adjust and find new ways of delighting customers. And this has been interesting because, and particularly for women, a lot of women business owners actually solved a problem they had in their own life, shared it with their friends, and before you know it, became a business. Now, one thing about COVID is it's created so many new problems to solve, and that's in part the story I think that sits behind the real uptick in business formation. We're seeing here, though, that those that have had to adapt and adjust are going to hang on. Half are going to hang on to what they've piloted and been obliged to implement during COVID, and you're getting into this hybrid kind of business model now, coming back with things that have worked in the past, but really inculcating some great new practice, new models, new ways of doing business. So that's pretty significant. There is a grim number there, though. There still is a lot of people worried about, their vital signs in their business are causing them great distress. But as I mentioned earlier, some have had a fantastic pandemic. They've been well placed, movement restrictions and economic constraints. They've been able to navigate those well, or as Tui has outlined, maybe picked up some of the new types of business and enterprise that the public health settings have generated. So they've done okay. Next page, thanks, Suana. This is interesting. I know a lot of discussion is around the number of insolvencies right now. I still hold the view that it's artificial. The field evidence does not line up with this. And I'm troubled by that. I mean, anyone who's been in the capital cities, Tui and I and a number from Monash on this call have been in the world's most locked down city in Melbourne. It has affected the entrepreneurial atmosphere and the business mojo. I'm sorry, it's not a technical term, but you can feel it. You can feel it and you can see it. And when I look at where new businesses are being created, and I look through some of the private sector data that's available, entrepreneurship is heading north. It's leaving Victoria, just as the population's leaving Victoria. And I'm worried about that in the longer term. But what sits behind that, though, is a lot of economic distress. But the usual players that would, in that horrible term, creative destruction in the enterprise space, would pull the trigger on a business with no pulse, have sat on their hands. They've not wanted to be seen to be proactive in insolvency action. And you think about the tax office, they've had a support and assist disposition. Well, that's now coming back to a more leaning in approach to tax compliance. And the big banks, an awful lot of small businesses did reach out for some relief in the early phases, but then realized that a repayment holiday still saw a capitalization of interest and arguably more lead in the saddlebag when they come back to re-engaging in the economy. You think about that with finance, think about that with leasing arrangements, you think about that with equipment finance and other things that have been postponed or deferred, then they haven't gone away. So they're still there. And as people imagine what that liftoff looks like post-COVID, there's more weight in this plane to take off. And we know that a lot of fuel and all the systems are tested in a plane as it pelts down the runway, getting ready to take off. It still hasn't taken off. So in Victoria, every time you've had a reopening, there's been an added cost and liquidity challenge to get yourself ready to take off. And not always has that takeoff been like a jet fighter. It's been quite flat or more like a Boeing jet that, it hasn't always lived up to expectations. And the bounce back after each lockdown has been slightly less than the one before. So let's think about those things. The other thing I just want to spend a minute on, and some of your colleagues, there's been some fantastic academic work done in New South Wales around insolvencies, and really calling out the gap between businesses that atrophy, let's use that word, they just shrivel up and die in the corner, versus ones that are formally and appropriately discontinued. And the insolvency numbers are what, about 1 in 11 of the number of businesses that actually cease operating. So what's happening with that other group? There's an untidy dismount. Are matters wrapped up appropriately? Are all legal obligations addressed? And we're currently in this mode of getting all directors to get a director ID. And I'm saying to the tax office and regulators, do you know a lot of small businesses probably don't know their directors? That's the stuff their trusted advisors look out for. And so that's going to be an interesting time. And it does cause me to pause for a minute, reach for my coffee cup, which is now behind me, so I won't. And we're supposed to have a cup, toast a cup to the bookkeepers in Global Bookkeeper Week. Thank you, Tui, for doing that for me. So there's a lot going on there. The insolvency reforms the Commonwealth put in place, I've championed for years. I'm not sure the implementation's been quite right, and the uptake certainly hasn't shot the lights out. No one could say those restructuring measures have peaked early. Let me put it that way. So let's move on to the next slide. So that's a bit of what's going on behind. I've touched on, but that's the anatomy of it, and that financial distress continues. The mental distress I've touched on. The thing to watch, though, is what are the major creditors going to do coming back? And what happens if interest rates go up? I mean, these are going to be further challenges to businesses uncertain about what their liftoff looks like the other side of COVID. Next slide. Thanks, Suana. we're doing okay for time. So far, so good. This is good. So, this is something I keep encouraging people to think about. What does that recovery journey look like? It's not like policymakers can now just rest back and let it all take its course. Let's imagine, Tui, if you and I had a franchise coffee business in one of NAB's 3 office towers in Melbourne, and we know they're going to go to 1 as changing work models change. But what if we were in the one that they're leaving? We paid handsomely. We're paying, $4,000 a month for 2 car parking spaces in the foyer, knowing that 3,500 people will walk past our door every day, and we're going to delight a large chunk of them. There is our business. Now, we've taken a rent deferral. We've had no income for a while. The city of Melbourne looks, I hope no one's offended by what I won't say what I was about to say. Feels like another capital city in Australia, doesn't feel like Melbourne. And we go to open and there's just no foot traffic. The humans simply aren't there. So what do we do? What do we do? David Gregory is a smart operator. He's in the coffee shop next door, but he's got a landlord that says, no, I'm not going to ride you for that $3,000 or $4,000 a month. I know the foot traffic's not there. Let's revisit the rent. That's a key. It's a fixed outgoing. And we know it's not realistic because you don't have that foot traffic. So David's got an adjustment opportunity because he's got a willing participant being the landlord beside him. What do Tui and I do? Well, we know the track we're on and it's not pretty. So there's some of those adjustment challenges, particularly in the CBD, that are still ahead of us as we work through what does this new setting look like. But there has been this renaissance in entrepreneurship. I'm upbeat about that. Those new business registrations, people inquiring about buying businesses, even buying a franchise opportunity, the startups that are out there. I think COVID's caused a lot of people to think about what really matters in their lives. And for some, working for the man or the woman, the commute into the CBD, they just thought, I feel like I'm living to work here. I'm not working to live. And people have wanted to bring, I think, a little more of the locus of control about their livelihoods and their economic circumstances back to them, and have been thinking about other options. We know some of that's been born out of, difficult times. We saw, and some of that material was touched on by Suana. We know a lot of that early COVID response was people really shrinking larger businesses back to core operations. So if you had specialist skills, they go, look, Tanya, happy to stay on with you, and your particular communications and research and data analytics skills are fantastic, but can we have it a couple of days a week? And so, Ms. Gerardo then becomes a contractor. Her ecosystem knows she's fantastic at what she does. They go, hey, Tanya, I'd like a couple of days too. And before you know, an employee's become a self-employed personal service income business. And I think there's a bit of that been going on as well. And people haven't minded having that locus of control about their livelihoods and their lives brought a bit closer to them. So I reckon it's going to be some interesting times ahead. So capital city real estate prices, flog your house in Melbourne, move to the bush, you can get a very good level of amenity and have a great whack of cash left over. And I think some of that's been going back into enterprise ambitions as well. The last thing I'd touch on, and we all love a bit of analysis, but love the economists and the concept of escape expenditure. Those spending on goods and services, not in communities where you live, not your domicile space, but where you work. So, thinking about an example, you can tell I've come straight from the gym. Yeah, right. I go and buy my ASICs near my workplace, not near my home. But during COVID, with a lot of people working from home or elsewhere, those expenditures were happening nearer to where they live. And I remembered being with the now New South Wales Premier at a workshop talking about how to, re-energize Sydney's CBD. They were hand-wringing that let's call it gross capital product out of Sydney was down 16%. I said, in Melbourne, they take 16% as gross capital product right now, but that 16% you're talking about in Sydney is at a time that gross state product had actually grown. So it's more a displacement rather than it being lost. And so do you try and drag that back out of the regional centres and suburbia, or do you try and find a new reason and new value and new ways of delighting people coming to the city? So they're big discussions that we've got to have. Next slide. Thank you, ma'am. Whole bunch of schemes that are out there. We can spend a little bit of time on those. Loss carrybacks proved to be very successful. Cash flow boost, vital. JobKeeper was excellent, timely, courageous. Although, in retrospect, people are going, oh, you could have maybe tidied up a few of the edges. The guaranteed loan scheme in its 4 incarnations still hasn't, there was a $40 billion provision for that at the Commonwealth. I think last time I looked, there's a little around $5 billion has gone out the door. Why? Traditional financiers, the big banks, not that interested in new to bank customers. They're really just looking at using that facility to support customers they've currently got. And then some of the conditions for eligibility, people weren't that enamored with it. So that hasn't, but then at the same time, you hear the Treasury officials talking about the abundant liquidity in the economy, and that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out for business, for investment, for consumer behavior as we head into the new year. Next one, thanks to Anna. During COVID, if digital wasn't everything, it was pretty darn close to it. We have seen an enormous uptake in digital engagement, a deepening of that digital engagement. You all know I'm an evangelist for this. So in my time as the Director of Small Business and Enterprise at Deakin University and with the IPA Deakin Research Centre, a lot of focus. Future Learn, there's a MOOC with me spruiking the need for digitisation. Huge hit in Nigeria, but anyway, that's a discussion for another day. That digital engagement, though, was really quite crucial. And we saw a vast majority doing more digital, not just for the immediately obvious e-commerce fulfillment channels, those sorts of things, but even in the way they handled the business of running their business, so that more time could be spent on what their magic, what the spark is that thrives and drives their entrepreneurship, not the stuff of compliance and back-end processes. So a big uptake there, and it was vital to helping a lot of businesses manage costs, but also maintain an engagement with their customers. You found, 2 out of 5 more productive, fantastic. A third more profitable. Interestingly, though, nearly 9 out of 10 are saying we've road tested some digital tools, we're going to keep them. So that's fantastic. But let's think about the consumer lens. Big uptick in e-commerce participation. If you're a real tailor and had no digital visibility, character building COVID times for you. For those that have been in that space, still could delight their customers. Big uplift in participation, but still significantly under what e-commerce activity is for consumers in the UK. So a similar market, even with the big bolt up that's happened during COVID, we're still behind the UK. So for those businesses hoping that whole e-commerce thing's going to go away, it won't, and so we're encouraging people to think about that. There's some government programs that are designed to support that, but peer leadership, like people talking with other like business owners about their experience as pathfinders, really quite vital at this time. The other thing though is, and we can touch on this a bit later, the whole social piece. Now, businesses that are using social media as a broadcast medium, not full value, those using it to nourish relationships with customers really saw some uplift. And during the time, even when transaction traffic was low, you saw smart small businesses using social media to build their connections with their community, to remind people that their presence is a part of the community, and actually projecting forward their expertise and their extra level of care and service. Why is that so important? Well, when you go digital, you're not the only one there. So if you were in like a retail precinct where, my wife and I, we owned a gallery and a fine Australian gift shop in Mornington, eye-wateringly expensive rents. Anyway, character building, and we lived the dream of pillow talk of cash flow, possibly the greatest contraceptive ever invented, owning a business with your partner. Anyway, discussion for another day. But we knew when we were online, all of a sudden we had cheap knockoffs emulating us. We had other providers challenging us on price. There's no sloppy margins in the digital world. So for businesses that were used to sort of maybe a more geographically condensed customer base, all of a sudden opening themselves up through digital channels to a wider customer base, tick, great. They put themselves in the field with others doing the same thing. And if you're offering a commodified kind of offering, it was all and only about price. And so those margin squeezes then started impacting on the business. Volumes up, margins down, profitability, question mark. And so what people were doing was using social to sort of make themselves a little bit more than a commodified offerer. And you know, we've seen examples where people have built communities. I mean, there's one I love down in Gippsland in Victoria, a global leader in colouring fabrics and yarns for interior designers. Now, their social media community is many times bigger than Merbau North, where their physical community is. But when something happened, they were out there talking about, you know, an event showcasing people's wares, what they'd created. And apparently, if you're into that that sort of craft, there's a real uplift in you showing your stuff to others to go, wow, that's a great creation. They were activating that. And in the background, by the way, we can provide you with all of these great services. So that was really interesting. There's still more ahead though. And, you know, we've got things like e-invoicing, that PEPOL standard, trying to reduce transaction costs for the lodgement of invoicing, reduce error rate, increase security, and then hopefully enable a more timely payment. That's going to be something that's ahead, and another example where, you know, the technology is going to play a role. Thanks, Suana. Next slide. Sorry, I got a bit evangelical there. My apologies. This is all interesting and quite sober. That cautious optimism that we're seeing in the economy is there. We're also hearing a lot of people saying, I've got supply chain constraints. I can't get talent, skilled or unskilled. There's just no humans there to support my team and to drive my business. But you've still seen a picture that some have done well over the last 12 months. Digital's been a key part of that. Navigating this changing nature of work has presented opportunities and challenges, and you know, and that's been widely reported. But you also look at this resilience lens coming in through adaptation and new technology deployment, and I would argue a need to business plan with contingencies in mind now, because we saw, I think it was 44 days of cash is the average amount held by a business. People are thinking they need a bit more buffer and an adaptation reservoir, cash reserves down, emotional reserves down. They'll need to be rebuilt a little bit as well. Next slide. Thank you, Suana. This is just interesting. As we go into Christmas, I'm trying to promote this kindly customer concept. You know, please be patient is my message to customers. You've got business owners that never imagined they'd become bouncers. You know, show us your COVID certificate. I mean, they're difficult conversations. You've got sectors of the economy where we've got vaccine hesitation, and, you know, the hairdressing fraternity, for instance, you got 80,000 ABNs in hairdressing. A lot may not want to be vaccinated. Where does that do? Pushes people into operating from homes. All of a sudden, the shadow economy becomes an issue. Some of these COVID policy settings actually conspire against other objectives that we have. And that's something that could play out in interactions between customers and small businesses. So we're just saying, you know, please be kindly customers, highlighting the value of spending local and small, and just considering the offer, the delightful offer that small businesses have. Next slide. Thanks, Suana. Just checking the time. We're still just about okay. I'll wrap it up quite quickly. Next slide. Just a touch point on what the small business commissioners and myself were saying needs to be part of the picture going forward. Dependability. You know, if you've got an exit plan or some policy settings, execute dependably so that people can plan for however difficult it is. We all know uncertainty is terrible. Seat at the table. We've seen too many examples where policy decisions have been made and it's clear that small business hasn't been around the table, not front of mind. That's something needs to be changed. Payment times have slipped out a little bit. We've seen reporting regimes introduced. That's helping a little bit, but you know, we saw people hanging on to their cash a bit longer in payment. The access to support, I mean, there's been some criticism that some of the government programs haven't landed as precisely as you'd want. The aim was to make it as straightforward and as timely as possible. I know in my state, I think we were into lockdown 6 and people were still waiting for lockdown 4 payments to come through. I mean, that's just not satisfactory. And the last one is, and I'm quite adamant that we need to do a better job of clear, dependable instructions for COVID rules. I call it actionable information. Small businesses don't have, 15 work health safety experts in their team who can navigate ambition-driven regulatory arrangements. They want to know, what is it I need to do? And to get that sort of advice across is pretty helpful. Next one, thanks, Joanna. Just a little bit of some stuff that's going on in the regulatory space. We can come back on that. I've touched on least cost routing, e-invoicing. We're also doing a little bit around procurement. We still think there's enormous scope there, and using procurement strategically to support economic recovery. The debt stuff is interesting. The farm debt stuff is still working through. We've still got a lot of bushfire stuff working through. Yet you're finding small businesses now really wondering how to handle the debt that's there, and just getting out there, encouraging people to buy local. Next one, thanks, Suana. Bit of an opportunity, I think, around exporting. Let's not spend too much time on it because we don't have the time. But the SME proportion of our goods exports is comparatively low to other G7 countries in the EU. There's scope to uplift that. That brings with its own challenge. Next slide, thanks, Suana. Won't spend too much time on this. We'll circulate the material, but that just gives you a bit of an idea about what can we do to support SME engagement in export opportunities. Whole lot of discussion we can have around that we don't actually have time for. So I might just say, let's go to the final slide. We are here to help. I guess, let me put it this way. My ambition is for our agencies to be the best ally a small and family business can count on. And we do that through a number of channels. Through our assistance work, where there are pain points, we use that to surface where policy and program improvements can be made. If we see regulatory change coming in, and I'll share with you, I am currently pimping an idea of a small franchising and codes list in the Federal Circuit Court so that we can get business owners able to defend their own economic interests where they've been infringed upon, and we can get regulators to enforce these codes. There's no point having a code. We've got a discussion up here in the Capitol about a breach of franchising code triggering a $10 million fine. That's great. But if the waddy is bigger, if the penalty is bigger, but it never comes off the shelf, it's not serving any good purpose. So I'm thinking about what sort of justice infrastructure changes can see small and family businesses ready and able and assisted to defend their own economic interest, not see what is a very quaint Australian characteristic where if something's not right, people flee to the regulators, expecting the regulators to defend their own economic interests, and they've got public policy disciplines as well. The ACCC, get a code breach, Suana and I might be absolutely done over by our franchisor. We go to the ACCC and they go, yeah, I know your life's ruined, and we lost you as an entrepreneur contributing to the economy, but is there a material impact on Australia's economy? Well, no, just our lives. Is it a systemic failure? Well, at this stage, we're the first ones to be done over, so no. And is there considerable public interest? Yeah, it's big in our world, but not in anyone else's. They won't enforce it. So what happens? We get frustrated that the regulatory framework's failing us. Regulators say, once you've regulated and these problems still happen, they don't question whether the regulation was an appropriate policy response. They dial it up even more without actually understanding the anatomy about why what's already been done hasn't been as effective. Answer, it hasn't been taken out for a run. It hasn't been enforced. What's the problem there? Federal court jurisdiction, 3-year delays, cost order gorillas. We've got to do better than that. So that's one of the ideas I'm pumping around. Might leave it at that. Way too much talking from me, but over to you.